Hello, I'm Maurice Powell. Welcome to A Little Like Music, Manx Radio's regular Thursday evening classical music hour. And I'm going to introduce a composer this evening, hopefully play 2 or 3 pieces. A composer who's never appeared in this series before. He's a classical composer, a contemporary of Mozart and Beethoven and Schubert. But I'm fairly certain I've not played anything by this composer before, and his name may be completely unfamiliar to you. This is Franz Danzi, D-A-N-Z-I. Born in 1863, he was slightly younger than Mozart, a little bit older than Beethoven. He was born into a very musical family of Italian origin in Mannheim. Now, Mannheim was famous for its orchestra, which was sort of a European-class orchestra. Mozart spent time in Mannheim and knew the orchestra very well indeed, and was very much inspired by the wonderful musicians. He said it was an orchestra of soloists. There were no rank-and-file players. They were all excellent. I don't know whether Mozart met Danzi or members of the Danzi family. I can't recall. I'll have to check Mozart's letters. Now, at the age of 15, Danzi became a cellist in that orchestra. Now, just after that time, the whole of the court at Mannheim moved to Munich and took the orchestra and the whole lot with them. But Danzi stayed on at the National Theatre in Mannheim and wrote several operas there in the 1790s. He then undertook a cultural tour of Europe. He went to Germany, Bohemia and Italy with his wife. He returned to Munich as Vice Kapellmeister, quite like the number 2 job, if you like, at the Hofoper, the court opera, and became in charge of writing the comic opera productions. In 1807, he moved to Stuttgart as a full Kapellmeister and then on to Karlsruhe in 1812. He was a noted teacher. He died in 1826, comparatively young. He was really what we might call a Mozart transmitter. Mozart was very much the benchmark for Danzi, and you either came up to scratch or you didn't. And his music is quite like Mozart's in many ways. His operas have a certain affinity with the magic flute, and his piano concertos, which are lovely, his wife was a concert pianist, have a familiar ring about them if you know the Mozart piano concertos well. Let's start then with an overture by Danzi, just to start the programme this evening. This comes from an opera called Der Berggeist, or The Mountain Spirit. It was composed in 1813 for the theatre in Karlsruhe. It was one of a series of spooky operas at that time. Weber and Louis Spohr also set very much the same story in their operas, and of course Weber's Der Freischütz was one of the spookiest operas ever written. But there were other composers as well. Marschner, for example, with his Hans Heiling, and Der Vampire, of course, a splendid piece full of ghosts, spirits, fairies and evil gnomes. Here then, the overture to Der Berggeist. The overture to a forgotten opera, Franz Danzi's Der Berggeist, The Mountain Spirits, first produced in Karlsruhe in Germany in 1813. I have a recording of the opera and it's charming, quite spooky in places, lots of ghostly choruses. A very interesting piece, not likely to be revived today. Maybe in Karlsruhe they might revive it, who knows. But worth spending £1 or two on a CD if you ever come across it. So, something very familiar now, but something I don't think I've played, not for quite some time. This is the intermezzo from the Corelia suite of Sibelius, one of his lighter pieces. We know that some of Sibelius's music, 4th and 7th symphonies in particular, Tapiola, wonderful standalone orchestral piece, are quite demanding to play and to listen to. Others are life-enhancing, 2nd Symphony, the 5th Symphony, wonderful violin concerto, but there's a whole range of shorter pieces by Sibelius. He certainly had a popular touch in the same way that Elgar did, if you like, with his shorter pieces. Anyway, the Karelia, I understand, is in northern Lapland, so sort of, you need your wellies and overcoat and a scarf and gloves to go there, I think. Anyway, the intermezzo from the Karelia suite of Sibelius. The intermezzo from Sibelius' Karelia Suite, and the rest of the suite is very attractive as well. A little bit of nostalgia now. Now and again, I can't resist the temptation to include something, normally of one of the variety stars, that performed here in Douglas in the heyday of the tourist industry, either at the Villa Marina or at the Palace Coliseum or the Derby Castle Opera House. And on this occasion, I found a song sung by Anne Shelton. Her famous number was Lay Down Your Arms and Surrender to Mine. She was immensely popular, and she came here several times and always a sellout. She had a wonderful voice, arguably a much better voice than the other sort of 40s sweethearts, Vera Lynn, of course, who I never cared for her voice particularly, and Gracie Fields, who always imagined, I think, that she would be the official Forces sweetheart, but just simply wasn't. She was eclipsed by Vera Lynn. But a better voice than either of those two was, in my view, Anne Shelton. Here she is singing Nightingale Nightingale sang in Berkeley Square, recorded in 1940. The very powerful voice of Anne Shelton. I suppose you'd say she was sort of a mezzo-soprano, really, almost possibly a contralto, but these names don't really mean anything outside the world of opera and classical music. She was a wonderful artist, as I say, immensely popular. She came here several times after the war into the late 1950s. and was always very, very well received. So let's go back to our composer of the week, if I can put it that way, Franz Danzi. Here is a movement from one of his piano concertos. This is a concerto in E-flat major, written in 1799, possibly for his wife, who was an excellent concert pianist. This is a very attractive piece. I'm just going to play the first movement. It reminds me quite a bit of Mozart, just in the way the music is kind of organised, but also in the wonderful touches of woodwind instruments that is a particular joy of Mozart's piano concertos. And we find it here as well, solo clarinets and things, and bassoons coming through quite regularly. This is a charming piece. I'm not sure how many piano concertos that Danzi wrote. I've heard a cello concerto of his, which is very fine. I'll have to do a little bit more research. Anyway, the opening movement of Franz Danzi's piano concerto in E-flat major of 1799. the first movement of a piano concerto in E-flat major, written in 1799 by Franz Danzi. And I think that was a beautiful piece, very well written. Love the sort of the woodwind interpolations. Very hard to fault it, really. I'm very happy to hear a piano concerto by Danzi occasionally. He kind of bridges the gap, doesn't he, between the piano concertos of Mozart and Beethoven, and it tends to avoid the showiness of the later sort of virtuoso concertos, starting with Hummel and so forth. A very interesting composer. If that music's anything to go by, he seems to have been a very amiable sort of chap, and certainly he became good friends with Weber, Spohr and other of his contemporaries, and they all speak very highly of him. We may have time for one more very short piece later in the programme. However, that's something completely different. A composer who I'm fairly certain I've never played in this series, a British light music composer, Walter Collins. He was a composer, obviously, and a musical director, particularly associated with the famous Delawarr Pavilion in Bexhill-on-Sea. He wrote countless pieces of music for the Paxton Music Library of short, descriptive, useful pieces of music, and made over 100 recordings in the 1940s. So there's obviously a lot of Walter Collins out there, and I'll have to see if I can find some more pieces. Here's a very short piece just to introduce him, Cumberland Green. Attractive piece that by Walter Collins, Cumberland Green. Yes, I'm going to have to look out some more of his pieces, I think. An interesting and charming piece. as is my next piece, which I do vaguely remember, although I'm fairly certain I've never played it on this programme. It's by Colin Smith, and it's called Looking Around. Colin Smith's real name was Lloyd Thomas, and he was famous as an organist, but he also wrote lots of pieces of attractive music, including the theme tune for the BBC television children's programme from the 1950s, The Appleyards. Now then, how many of us remember The Appleyards? Did that have a young actor who played the son in the family, Christopher Beanie, who I've subsequently seen as an adult in various TV programmes? I'm not sure. But I do remember The Appleyards. It was basically a family soap, but quite attractive, and one of the very first of the sort of regular soap operas. I mean, it was aimed at children's television, but everybody watched it, I think. Anyway, here we have Looking Around, the theme music then from The Appleyards by Colin Smith. Charming little piece there, Looking Around by Colin Smith, which you may remember from the 1950s BBC television children's programme, The Appleyards. Let's return very briefly to our composer of the week, Danzi, Franz Danzi, the Mannheim-born composer who had great success with his symphonies, operas in particularly, but also concertos. And here's a little bit of music in a genre that he was very famous for, that of the wind quintet. This is really chamber music, if you like, for flute, oboe, clarinet, horn and bassoon. So these are quite challenging pieces. Every instrument is really a soloist. They're not too serious. They're lively, they're tuneful, sometimes very energetic and virtuosic, but really music to relax to, not like the more serious string quartets of the era, of which Danzi wrote a few of those as well. Let's just hear, to get a flavour, here's the Allegretto, the finale of a wind quintet in B-flat major from a set, opus 56. The finale of a very attractive wind quintet by our composer of the week, Franz Danzi. We'll hear more of Danzi in a future programme, I'm sure. Let's return to British light music, but an unfamiliar composer really in the genre of British light music. So Granville Bantock, best known for his symphonies and sacred works, the Hebridean Symphony, for example, or the Celtic Symphony, and of course a mammoth oratorio, Omar Khayyam, full of wonderful things, which is very rarely, if ever, performed today, although it has been recorded. So, Granville Bantock, not your average British light music composer, but here's a lovely little piece called Twilight Memories. Granville Bantock, or Sir Granville Bantock, I should say, Twilight Memories, an uncharacteristically light piece from a very interesting and colourful composer. And here's something quite different as well, a composer who certainly has never appeared here, the late German Romantic composer Franz Schmidt. He was a contemporary of Humperdinck of Hansel and Gretel fame. He wrote an opera called Notre Dame, which is basically the story of the Hunchback of Notre Dame. And here is the interlude from that opera, a very lush piece. rather lush intermezzo there from the opera Notre Dame by Schmidt. I think I said his name was Franz Schmidt. I have a feeling it might have been Florent Schmidt. I'll check that out. That brings us to the end of the programme. Just something to play us out with. I hope you've enjoyed my selection. Rather unusual, lesser known 18th century, and one or two surprising light music pieces as well. Please join me next Thursday at 9. In the meantime, Robert Farnham's Goodwood Gallop. Goodbye.